Well, how much of the pandemic was planned, and are there clues that show us this? Well, redacted correspondent Dan Cohen found one kind of accidentally, and he's here to tell us all about it. So, first of all, Dan, how did you find this? And take us through it because it's quite shocking.
Yeah, Natalie, I was doing research for a piece I'm working on about the lab origin theory, which I think fundamentally is some kind of psyop. But I came across this video that we're going to watch, which really adds another piece of evidence to the body of evidence, I would say, that shows that the COVID-19 response was planned out ahead of time, and we basically lived a premeditated plan. So everyone, of course, remembers Event 201. That's well known, the simulation of a pandemic held by Johns Hopkins University, the World Economic Forum, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That showed how a response to a supposed pandemic was gamed out, and then months later came to fruition. Well, so I've uncovered this video from the Council on Foreign Relations from June of 2019. Remember the Johns Hopkins University, the Event 201 piece was from October 2019. So this one actually predates it, 4 months. So this is from the Council on Foreign Relations from June 2019. Before we start, understand that the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, is the single most prestigious and influential Washington think tank. So the fact that this video was published by the CFR speaks volumes, and its corporate members, who it represents, are all the usual suspects, the mega corporate entities that are basically more powerful than many countries. So it's a representation of this supranational elite: BlackRock, Bank of America, Apple, Google, Meta, Facebook, Goldman Sachs. I mean, it's huge. Pfizer is on the list. It has a massive donor list of billionaire venture capitalists, including, of course, the Gates Foundation, among many, many others. So let's go ahead and watch this video from, again, June 2019, before the so-called COVID-19 pandemic began. It's titled, "What a Zombie Apocalypse Can Teach Us About Pandemics." And the description reads, "What would happen if one day the dead rose up, hungry for human flesh and brain? This scenario has played out in movies and books for decades, but science fiction fans aren't the only ones giving some thought to the zombie apocalypse. The CDC, major universities, and even the Department of Defense have plans for the day the dead rise, not because they expect it, but because it serves as a useful intellectual exercise for infectious disease and foreign policy. Although international protocols exist to prevent the rapid spread of disease, each country's individual policies, infrastructure, and interests ultimately decide the course of any outbreak, including zombies." So the CFR, CDC, Pentagon, and whichever universities they're referring to were not planning for a viral pandemic per se. They were planning a real military response for a fictional threat of a zombie apocalypse, or in order to make people think that a virus would be equal to a zombie apocalypse. So let's get started with the video.
Okay.
Zombies, the flesh-eating, brain-hungry monsters that ravenously attack the world until everyone is infected. Could such a frightening science fiction disaster actually happen? As far-fetched as it seems, according to what we know from lore and canon, zombieism would work the same way as infectious diseases like SARS, Ebola, and the flu. Once a person gets infected, they pass it from person to person via close contact.
So they're comparing SARS, Ebola, and the flu with zombieism. First of all, those are all very different viruses. The flu is a seasonal respiratory virus that everyone has had many times. And the treatment, as I don't know, any parent knows, or anybody in general, is rest and fluids. You get the flu, you stay home until you're better.
Right.
And Ebola, right? Ebola is not contracted the same way. It's not the aerosol droplets hanging in the air like the flu or a respiratory virus. It's transmitted through blood and bodily fluids. So the fictional threat of zombieism, of course, is completely different than any of those. But there we have the CFR video equating all of them.
Well, what they're doing is giving us the idea that our bodies are weapons and that we cannot be sure of what we're passing or contracting. That's what they're weaving through this thing that, yes, we should not equate. That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's keep going.
Okay.
As with any newly emerging pathogen, the search for a cure would be complicated, since its origins would likely be a mystery.
So, of course, they'll need a pharmaceutical product supposedly to combat this disease, which is of unknown origin to this day, right? Starting to sound familiar. Does this sound familiar to what's been going on
Yes.
and what has gripped the media for, I don't know, the last 3 years to this very day?
Yes, absolutely. It's like we're reading a script that we lived.
Exactly. Okay, let's keep going.
Scientists believe the risk of such a devastating scenario is growing larger. People are building homes in new areas, living and working near unknown insects and animals, which can carry new unknown diseases, increasing the chances of a deadly outbreak that could possibly spread around the world.
So this idea that urbanization, basically cities expanding into natural areas where these wild viruses that we've never encountered are lurking and then causing pandemics. I remember this being promoted early on as an explanation that urbanization causes pandemics, and as if urbanization is this brand new phenomenon in, the last 20 years or something.
Right.
Here's Bill Gates, Gavi, promoting that same narrative. And if you search urbanization and pandemics, there are dozens of articles on this. So I don't know. It strikes me as a little bit odd that narrative was in this video and then was promoted early on at the beginning of the pandemic.
Right.
Such a disease wouldn't adhere to borders or politics.
Okay, so such a disease, such a virus would not adhere to borders or politics, except that's not what happened. The Canadian scientist Denis Rancourt has shown through studying excess mortality that whatever was killing people did in fact respect borders. In other words, it wasn't a virus that was particularly deadly, it was the government response. Those deaths were a result of policy. You can see that in maps he's shown of Europe, where in Spain, in certain areas of Spain, there were huge amounts of deaths. Meanwhile, in Portugal and in France and in Germany, there were not until later. So it's not the behavior of a viral pandemic. And similarly, there wasn't excess death in Canada, but there was excess death in a given period of time early on, all in areas in the United States. And then you can see that by jurisdiction inside the United States too, state by state, depending on which areas locked down. So that is not the behavior of a viral pandemic or a zombie apocalypse.
Right. Clearly.
It would require international coordination and decisive action. All countries are legally bound to survey and monitor for disease within their borders. But many poorer countries simply don't have the infrastructure. And depending on where a zombie case was identified, the reaction could be very slow, allowing ample time for the disease to spread. A country might even attempt to hide the existence of an outbreak for political or diplomatic reasons, perhaps to avoid disruptions in trade and travel, and try to contain it quietly. But with insufficient attention to the issue, and with something as infectious as zombieism, a spread might be inevitable, and precious time for preparation while the outbreak was still nascent would be lost.
Is that not like the exact narrative we were told and continue to be told about China, that they covered up the virus and let it spread all over the world? And they even have like the picture of some like dictator. I don't know if it's supposed to be Hitler or if it's Xi or what, but I mean, keep in mind the CFR represents not only big pharma interests and the military-industrial complex, but just the U.S. power structure overall that sees China as this existential threat. And what better way to defeat it or smear it than to create the idea that it's responsible for this zombie apocalypse deadly pandemic.
Yeah, it's a bullseye for exactly what these power centers want.
Governments with plans for such an event and first responders at the ready would fare best. But without professionals treating and instructing people how to interact with infected individuals or how to protect themselves, the disease could spread fast. Amid an outbreak, the WHO would deploy medical staff and attempt to coordinate response efforts. But the WHO doesn't have the funding, staff, or resources to take the lead in halting a pandemic.
Doesn't have the resources, you say. Okay, where might one go and get those and grant themselves emergency powers to do so?
Exactly. The World Health Organization to the rescue with the US and European government money, and the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates is going to be the hero to stop the zombie apocalypse. I mean, isn't that basically just what happened?
Thank goodness for those power centers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bill Gates.
Individual governments would have to mount their own initiatives. Those countries would likely prioritize border security in their plan, regardless of WHO recommendations or law. They might lock down their borders and enforce travel bans to and from the center of the outbreak. And they might quarantine or isolate both actual and suspected zombies.
So there it is. They even put a wall cutting off China. They have like a giant wall to quarantine China. Somehow they knew that China would be supposedly at fault for this pandemic back in June of 2019, several months before any of this happened. And they knew that they would lock down and quarantine Europe. The CFR has like clairvoyant powers. It's uncanny.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you could have just written this in the year 2023 in arrears, but to have this before the pandemic, it's mind-boggling.
NGOs and aid groups would also spring into action, raising funds and sending medical staff to treat people. With numerous actors on the ground, it might be unclear who's in charge.
Does that not look like a reference to the loss of sovereignty, to the voluntary handover of sovereignty by so many governments to supranational organizations like the WHO? Is that what they're referring to? That they're saying, like, we're even going to basically supersede your government? We're going to be above them, basically dictating what they have to do. Are they not saying it? Am I interpreting that wrong?
No, they said it out loud. This was a plan.
Meanwhile, scientists and researchers would try to develop a vaccine or medication to halt the spread of zombies. But this could take months, while zombies continued to bite, infect, and spread.
Okay, that is exactly what we were told was happening with COVID. They said they had to fast track the vaccine. They were going to use emergency use authorization, and it would be a miracle, and it would be the silver bullet that would end the lockdowns and the quarantines and the mass death, and then we'd move on to the new normal. So somehow the CFR predicted it.
And here we are in that new normal.
And how did those injections, how did those vaccines, how did those medical products, pharmaceutical products actually work? Did they do what they were supposed to? No. So there's that too. They didn't predict that. That part was left out of the script. That
we were supposed to have full faith in them. Right. Exactly.
Right. Ultimately, researchers think that if a zombie plague actually occurred, few would survive. More people in richer countries might make it out alive, but poorer countries would be decimated.
Right, because zombies, just like pandemics, only affect poor countries, right? Only the poor are susceptible to zombies that want to eat your brain. So another hint that something entirely different actually happened than what they're blaming this on.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So what can be done now to protect the world from this zombie future, or from another disease that behaves like zombieism? All countries need to develop the basic health infrastructure to identify pandemics when they start. More funding and improved international coordination are needed for stronger investigations into how diseases spread. With increased financial support for research, scientists can prepare vaccines in advance for known diseases with potential to kill. And when a disease strikes, they can create better lab tests to detect who is infected and who is not.
Better lab tests to detect who is infected. Is that like the PCR test that tested for all kinds of coronaviruses and jacked up the threshold count so a papaya or a goat would test positive? I don't know if you remember that, Natalie, the president of Tanzania, John, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but John Magufuli, back in May 2020, he did that incredible speech and he showed basically how phony PCR tests really are. He tested a papaya and a goat. He swabbed them and they came back positive for COVID. And then he suspiciously died not long after. So,
I
but
don't remember that.
it's an incredible video that really everybody should see. There's all kinds of suspicion about actually 3 African leaders who basically rejected the whole COVID protocol that was rolled out, and they rejected and then died soon after. So I don't know what happened. Obviously, there's no
and
proof
now,
of that.
now they're selling, at least here in Europe, they're selling dual tests that can test for COVID and the flu that are just used with regular checkups. Now it's just like, oh, okay, let's test for both things. So, that also seems like a convenient new way to treat any kind of respiratory illnesses.
Right. And like, let alone whether you have symptoms or not. That's one of the other big
Yeah,
problems with the PCR tests. Like, you would never have, there are all kinds of pathogens in your nasal pharyngeal passage, in your nose, in your sinus, in your throat, that they could find at any time.
sure.
But just because there's some tiny trace amount of something that is non-culturable doesn't mean that you're infected with it. It just means you just aren't normal. So that was part of this whole paradigm that was rolled out, that any positive tests of any trace amount of something means you're positive and therefore you have to quarantine, which is a total farce. So that's
Yeah,
the same thing that they're continuing, that you're describing.
right. Yeah.
Disparities in global health must also be addressed. Poorer countries need stronger health systems and better preparation. Richer countries like the U.S. also have lots of room for improvement. No city in the U.S. currently has the capacity to treat more than a small number of patients infected with dangerous emerging diseases. An outbreak that infects just 50 people would likely overwhelm any American city. We won't be able to stop every new disease, but there are things the world can do to make sure it's far more resilient and ready for the zombie apocalypse or any other pandemic like it.
So I don't know. That video to me shows that basically every single aspect of the COVID era and the government response was planned out, really to an incredible degree that I didn't realize before, and should make, I think, everyone suspicious, even more suspicious of the popular narratives, maybe that were censored before even, or, narratives coming at us from all angles for different political currents and different political persuasions, that I think we're really being subjected to an incredible psychological operation. And in the description, they pointed out that the Pentagon is involved, the Department of Defense is involved, which the Department of Defense has been involved in the COVID response in every way since the very beginning. So, from lockdowns, quarantines, to the development of the treatments, every aspect of it is very much propagandistic. And I think this video really shows that we are living, as you described it, Natalie, as a scripted narrative that was preconceived. And there's another big piece of evidence.
It makes it really hard for even those of us who are like, well, that seems far-fetched. I don't know about that. It's a little out there. Maybe we just didn't understand and we all were doing our best and acting out of an abundance of caution. But when you see things like this, you think, no, this is too close to what we were prepped for. And it breaks apart that like, well, we just didn't know narrative. It breaks apart this benefit of the doubt. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. That's some crazy stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally. I think for a lot of average everyday people, you and me, we didn't know. And I really, I was even wiping down my groceries that I got from Trader Joe's, from the grocery store at first, and I was masking and all this stuff. And it took me a long time to kind of, get a hold of, to realize that I'd been propagandized and scared. I mean, it's about creating fear. That's why they use, I think, the term zombie apocalypse.
Right.
But it's just too over the top where it becomes absurd. I think average people were doing their best and going along with it and didn't know better. And there was such an incredible amount of fear porn being pumped out in every which way, every media outlet, to basically make us live in fear of our neighbors, to think our neighbors and our family members were existential threats to each other, and just have us in our homes consuming this, terror media. The powers, the CFR, the powers that be, the World Health Organization, the CDC, et cetera, they knew. And I think that's what this shows. And I think that's what Event 201 shows. So really I think our ire should be directed towards them.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that with us today. I am sufficiently freaked out, and also about zombies.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.